Ever since I started talking more passionately about Yakuza 5 while streaming in the past few years, I knew this day would come. Sooner or later. I knew it would. Why does Devil Leon 7 hate such a great game? What makes him constantly pick on this one game of the franchise and seemingly no other? Is it just bias? Personal gripes? Is he perhaps trying to brainwash or gaslight people into thinking Yakuza 5 is a horrible game when it's not? Well, sit down for a bit, because after all this time of people wondering about the answer and not really getting the full story, probably just catching snippets of whenever I do talk about the game on streams, it's finally time for us to have a proper video dedicated fully to my own thoughts and gripes about Yakuza 5 that leads me to say the things that I say about it. After all, if you don't actively watch my stuff, which hey, fair enough, we all got things going on, you probably don't have the full picture, and it's easier to think that I'm just whining about non-issues. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things, this video really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's just one person's personal thoughts on a game that remains beloved by many. Before I even start going into the specifics of anything with this video, I wanted to make a few things crystal clear. I know some of you meme about and exaggerate how much I dislike Yakuza 5, which is fine and dandy, but I do think there genuinely may be people who get mad whenever I talk about my issues with this particular game, and that might actually lead them to hate me just for that. So here's a couple of misconceptions to debunk here. Wait for it. Devil Leon 7, contrary to popular belief, does not hate Yakuza 5. No way. What? It's just on the lower end as far as personal enjoyment ranking of the Yakuza franchise goes, which is still not as bad as you might think, because to me at least, the average Yakuza game is still way more enjoyable to me than plenty of other games out there. Guys, for all of you wondering why is Yakuza 5 so low, why is this so low? Like I said when I put those in their rankings, these are not bad games per se. But for me personally, it could be either I didn't care about the story as much as the other games, or there were significant gameplay issues that I had with those games, or I just don't want to revisit these games, or I prefer not to revisit those games. And two, despite my issues with Yakuza 5, almost always when I talk about my problems with it, I always retain that it is still a great game that has something for everybody. So then, what's the issue here? If it's a great game, why do I put it on the lower end in my personal enjoyment ranking? Here's the main issue. This game is one of the least replay-friendly games in the franchise. There's multiple reasons as to why that is the case for me, and that is what this video will try to explain. Most of you watching this don't really need an introduction, but Yakuza 5 is technically the 5th mainline entry in the Yakuza / Like a Dragon franchise. I know what you Zero fans are thinking. No, Leon, it's the 6th entry. Well, this game came out before Zero, so what I said is still true. Here's an interesting tidbit about this game. The development cycle was one of those that took longer than usual because there was an engine shift coming off of Yakuza 4. I'm sure all of you are familiar with how RGG Studio tends to release their games almost yearly, which in itself is impressive, but also nothing new. Yakuza 1 came out in December 2005 in Japan, then 2 came out in December 2006. Kenzan came out in March 2008, just a little over a year. Yakuza 3 came out in less than a year after that, in February 2009. Yakuza 4 came out in March 2010, and Kurohyo 1 came out in that same year, only half a year later, in September. The sequel to Kurohyo would come out in March 2012, about a year and a half later, and later that same year in December, Yakuza 5 is released. Now, initially, I could have sworn I remembered the game being delayed to that date because of the devastating 2011 earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan. But I looked into it to jog my memory, and the area that was affected the most was the Tohoku region, which is a good distance away from Tokyo, where RGG Studio is located, and thankfully the reach wasn't that far. According to posts I found online of people living there, the earthquake was felt in Tokyo, but there was no serious damage. So then the development of Yakuza 5 likely wasn't impacted too much by what happened at the time, and things were proceeding as planned. The development of this game in particular was exciting to many fans because they were talking about how for the first time, something like getting into battles was going to be seamless. I don't have the clip at the moment, and honestly I don't know if I'll ever find it, given that there was a Japanese live stream, but they made it a point to feature things like that to showcase the new engine. Games before this one had visible loading going into the street fights. So, given what we just saw, new improvements like seamless fight transitions also meant a lot of other improvements, right? Well, yes, but also no. If you played any RPG game, it wouldn't take long to see that there are a lot of things about the games that are carefully thought through. There are some convenient features that were consistently brought back again or were taken and improved upon to make the games even better to play. For example, upon beating Yakuza 1 on the PS2, you unlocked Premium Adventure, which is the free roam mode where you're left to do whatever you want without worrying about the story. At this point of time, New Game Plus or Premium New Game was not a thing yet. They added that in Yakuza 2, but interestingly enough, Battle Review, as it's known in Yakuza 1, which you'll probably know better by Ultimate Battles or Climax Battles, or whatever you want to call it, was missing in this sequel. Yakuza 3 had all three of them, and so did Yakuza 4. Now mind you, it's not like Yakuza 5 dropped half the features or anything like that, but there are a couple of things about it that indicate either the game being rushed or features that were just forgotten in the heat of making the new engine as shiny as possible. There were also some gameplay design choices that felt backwards coming from Yakuza 4, so from here on, I'll be mentioning my major problems with the gameplay of Yakuza 5 and why, in my experience, I find them to be an issue. So here we go. During Premium Adventure in Yakuza 3 and 4, you could take the chance to level up, grind for specific items, completion rewards, and that kind of thing. Once you were done, and if you had any interest in going back to the story with all of your earned progress, you could talk to specific NPCs at the hideouts to convert that save into a New Game Plus save, so you could enjoy the story again with everything that you worked hard for. So obviously, Yakuza 5, the next breakthrough in the franchise, boasting 5 cities, 5 playable characters, 4 side stories, and much more, was going to have the same thing, right? Only makes sense for a game of that gigantic scale to let you grind in peace and possibly introduce even more grind-friendly options. Well, here's the thing. No. For some reason, this game that is all about an enormous amount of content went a weirdly anti-completion route in that sense, and it's the only game that does this. Yes, I know Gaiden doesn't even have New Game Plus, and neither does the Kaito files, but you know what's worse than that? Giving you New Game Plus, but spitting on your pancake and coffee after giving it to you. And what I mean by that is, picture this with me. You're a new Yakuza fan who's going through the series in order, or at least close enough. You finish Yakuza 4 after doing most of what there is to do in Premium Adventure, and you're like, alright, sick, I got everything. Maybe I'll revisit this game again and do some New Game Plus. You move on to 5. 5 doesn't let you escape Premium Adventure. Once you get in there, you're locked in there. This just never made sense to me. Did they really forget about this? For a game that has a completion list as a main attraction, it just seems nonsensical to me. So what this means is, Premium Adventure might as well not exist. If you want to do proper New Game Plus and keep all your progress in there, then you want to do everything in the main story, not Premium Adventure, completely defeating the purpose of the free roam mode. See, Gaiden has Premium Adventure and no New Game Plus to begin with, so at least you know that from the get-go. Once you beat the game, there is no bullshit around it, as much as it sucks. 5 gives you this illusion almost that yes, we do have a New Game Plus and the Premium Adventure that you know and love, but also, fuck you if you go in there. Why? No reason at all. The worst part about all of this is that they had the chance to fix this in the remaster release, and still nothing was done about it. They could have just added a random NPC, anybody in the hideout, where if you talk to them, they allow you to convert your Premium Adventure save to a New Game Plus one. But unfortunately, Yakuza 5's Premium Adventure remains an inferior version of otherwise a great feature that was downgraded for seemingly no good reason. Yakuza 1 up until 3 shared the same upgrade system where you have 3 or 4 different categories that you had to upgrade in a specific order. Meaning that if you wanted, for example, the 8th ability in the Soul category, you had to get every ability before it. You couldn't skip ahead to select what you wanted. Then came along Yakuza 4 and it introduced a super convenient leveling system that I would argue remains one of the best we've ever gotten even by today's standards. Every time you level up, you gain 3 orbs that you were allowed to use to pick any ability you wanted from a list of many kinds of moves. Granted, a few moves had prerequisites still, but you could still get the super handy abilities right from the get-go to make the game much more enjoyable without you having to wait until, say, the last 3 hours of the game. This is something about Yakuza 4 that I'll probably forever sing praises for. Now, Yakuza 5 surely was going to improve upon this system, if not just adapt the same one, right? Fuck no, this is Yakuza 5. You will go through extra hoops for no reason. You see, this game did a very weird hybrid of Yakuza 4's upgrade system and the older games. Technically, it's identical to Yakuza 1 to 3, where you can't get the 4th move in a category unless you get everyone before it. Only difference is, instead of using XP bars, you now use orbs. Man, they really thought they were cooking something with this. But hey, you know what's even worse than this? The fact that they have an all-new auto-leveling feature that picks abilities for you. Why the fuck would you ever not want to pick your own things that you see for yourself first? This feature is so useless, Snowiest would probably feature it in one of his videos to roast the shit out of it. A bit of a side note, but as I sort of alluded to already, I really don't care whether people like this game or not. My goal here isn't to say people are wrong for thinking what they're thinking, because at the end of the day, everybody is allowed an opinion and I have no right in telling them otherwise. Hell, I started the video by saying that my opinion doesn't and shouldn't matter to anybody who doesn't care. This video is just a conversation, kinda. One where you're just hearing me explain my stance. Nothing dictates that you have to agree or disagree. You're just hearing a guy out because you're curious. Or maybe you're hate watching, but if that's the case then weird. Now, when people tell me they like or dislike a game, that's really all there is to it. There's nothing for me to add to that except perhaps hear them out and discuss points of interest. Most of the time when people tell me about their favorite games, they will mention which game it is and briefly say why they picked that game. But there is a problem when you have people that are so adamant that their favorite video game is flawless in every way and the games that you like are trash, and they'll do everything in their power to pop their heads in at every chance, making sure that they repeat themselves about the same goddamn things, and they'll fucking make it one of their personality traits even. This is something that goes beyond just the Yakuza franchise discussion in general. This behavior just has me going, dude, I'm really happy for you that you like or dislike the game that you like or dislike, but for the love of God, shut the fuck up and stop pushing onto me why I should share your opinion on everything. Thankfully, this behavior is a rarity, and it should be because it just makes you look like an idiot who can't accept that people have different tastes. But unfortunately, I did encounter people like that on the channel before, which is why I bring this up. Okay, so you know how I repeatedly mentioned that a lot of my gripes with this game may not bother others? This one might be even more of a me issue than the rest, and nitpick by comparison. The previous 2 points I mentioned so far are objective downgrades, but ultimately it's just a matter of how much it bothers you. And I understand that not everyone finds them an issue, but to explain what I mean by this point, I'm not actually saying, yo, dialogue in Yakuza games? Absolute cringe. Because that would be a colossally idiotic statement. What I mean is that with Yakuza 5, this hinders gameplay, especially with replays, more than any other game. Consider this. I know that Yakuza 5 was the first game in its engine, and it was intended to be an ambitious as hell game. Again, 5 cities, 5 characters, yada yada, but that also meant a much larger story than Yakuza 4's. The hindrance doesn't come with the length and scope of the story per se, or even how good or bad the writing is, because I mean, we've all seen how Yakuza 4's story goes at times. What I'm talking about is the insanely extended amounts of in-game dialogue in comparison to 4. Just to put things in perspective, even by Yakuza 5's release, this franchise was no stranger to infodumps. I mean, look at Tommy in Yakuza 3 for God's sake. That section lasts 26 minutes if you skip nothing. Or the Kazuma infodump at the end of Yakuza 1. But here's what negatively sets Yakuza 5 apart from those. Both of those examples are easily skippable on replays. Even with Tamiya, with whom you have to pick like 5 different cutscenes to watch. It takes maybe a minute to fully skip everything, and that's like the worst skip in that game. Yakuza 5, on the other hand, has a lot of infodumps that are given in-game dialogue, where you have to basically hold the skip button to get through it, and skipping in 5 in particular is way slower in most of the dialogue. This is mainly because sometimes you actually have to wait for the character animations to play out first, which was not as much of a problem in the previous games. Combine that with the fact that it was the longest Yakuza game at the time, and you get a game that's nasty to replay. To give you an idea of how extensive it gets, and this is something that I know of thanks to the fantastic Yakuza speedrunner, Froob. The speedrun of the game is currently around 6 hours, half of which is just skipping dialogue. You might be thinking, okay, but the previous games also did have a bunch of in-game dialogue. They did, but they ramped up the in-game dialogue by an insane amount with 5, and it was made slower. It's especially bad with 5 because only half of a story-focused run is you actually playing the game. And in games prior to 5, a lot of these segments of in-game dialogue barely lasted half a minute, so they were not nearly as noticeable. Not just that, but Yakuza 5 also has a bunch of walk-and-talk dialogue segments that could not be fast-forwarded or skipped, so you had to sit through all of it. Yakuza 4 had only one segment like that, with Tanimura and Katsuragi. You might be thinking that this is a very specific thing if I'm bringing up speedruns, but I'm not a speedrunner. I just want to replay a game that I'm already familiar with and not have half of it be a waste of time, essentially. Speedruns can highlight glaring issues with a game when it comes to replaying them, and that's really the only reason I'm talking about them. So, you know, stuff like pacing issues maybe. I think anyone in general is more likely to replay a game that doesn't drag and make it so you have to crawl through mud for you to get through it. Sometimes, like Yakuza 5, you don't really have a choice. But if you did have the choice to make it convenient, I think anyone would choose that. Unless you're planning to watch the story again. I personally love revisiting certain games that I enjoyed at some point in the past. But I'd rather not sit through the story and the dialogue every time. It's just tragically funnier with Yakuza 5 because you're not forced to watch the story, you're forced to watch skipping. Which again, normally isn't an issue, but this is multiple hours of skipping. That is absurd. That is not skipping anymore, that's just bullshit. I have to give Dragon Engine Games a mega, super, ultra duper shout out for including the feature that allows you to skip every single fucking thing. In-game dialogue, full-on cutscenes, you name it. This by far remains one of my favorite quality of life additions that just makes all the Dragon Engine games much more tempting to replay than they'd otherwise be. And I want to just make it known that they've really cooked with that. Yakuza 0, being a game that came after Yakuza 5 and on that same engine, also suffers from the same dialogue problem, but they did attempt to try to implement the dialogue skips for at least some conversations. You couldn't skip every dialogue section, but it was still much better than nothing. This might be a bit of a general, like, franchise tangent, but I do feel like from Yakuza 5 onwards, there were times where they really started to extend the length of the narrative in a way that isn't really the best. I'm sure some of you may have noticed, but stuff like repeating a lot of the same thing, but rephrased at times. Once again, it's the most noticeable with 5 due to all the things you have to manually skip to get through the game. Whereas with many of the later games, you'd have to endure those the first time, yeah, but then you could quick skip them anytime you replay the game. On that topic actually, there's a little improvement in Infinite Wealth coming off of 7 that I'm sure some of you noticed. Remember those awkward mid-fight dialogue interruptions that you could argue ruin the flow of fights? In Infinite Wealth, there's only like a couple of those. Most of them are now just passive speech bubbles that you see on the side instead, and you could still hear the characters talk. The one improvement I'd like to now see going forward is letting optional content actually be optional and not shove it in your face at every chance. It's especially bad with Dondoko Island because on replays, you're forced to wait a minimum of 20 minutes real time to actually be able to get out of there and progress with the story. That is just horrible. But you know what's the best and funniest part about that? You may think I'm about to bullshit you, but I'm not. Infinite Wealth, even with all of its forced mandatory content, can be beaten faster than Yakuza 5 in less than 3 hours. Froob managed to beat the game in 2 hours 57 minutes. That is fucking insane. It only further paints Yakuza 5's replayability in a worse light than it already has. But I guess in Yakuza 5's defense, just a small defense, the time that Froob got was with a New Game Plus run for Infinite Wealth. So now you're probably just about ready to flip me off for how that's unfair, but hold the phone. There is one registered Yakuza 5 New Game Plus speedrun, and I'm gonna give you a couple of seconds to estimate that time. The time is sitting at 5 hours, 25 minutes. Still way slower than Infinite Wealth. Not even New Game Plus can save that game from the excessive dialogue skipping you have to sit through. Holy shit. It's crazy to think that if not for Infinite Wealth's ridiculous Dondoku visit on each replay, Froob's speedrun of Infinite Wealth could be sitting at only 2 hours and a half. Here's another thing to consider. I've been talking about professionals who, know the very intricate ins and outs of these games, and that's their times. If we're talking about the Yakuza 5 replay for the average person, which I consider myself the average person, then a good estimate for their New Game Plus playthrough would be anywhere between, I suppose, 6 to 8 hours, while Infinite Wealth might take anywhere between 3 to 5 hours, I think is a safe estimate. I think my fastest time on stream for 5 was over 7 hours and a half, and I still haven't done a quick run of Infinite Wealth, so that remains to be seen how long that takes for me. But if there's one thing I have to say about all of this, man, am I glad they added the Dragon Engine skips. Good lord. This is something that unfortunately shows itself time and time again with 5. Let's start with possibly the best example, Victory Road. In every game up until Yakuza 5, and even every single later game after 5, the Underground Coliseum would be this area you unlock after a certain point in the story. Very simple and straightforward. You can go there to fight many opponents and just enjoy the combat to its fullest. Doing well here could get you things like XP, armor, weapons, and even skills in some games. So all around, it's probably a place you'll come back to eventually because of how rewarding it can be. Now, what does our dear Yakuza 5 decide to do? Well, the game is like, hey, this feature that normally gets unlocked by story progression, how about to contribute to making Yakuza 5 as big as possible, so basically for no reason at all, we make the players spend a couple of hours as each character doing these very specific street fights that require them to find these specific spawns to unlock it. Now that's how you make content, right? You just take something previously available and now you have to work for it. Amazing. I can just imagine the meeting room. Oh, sir, I have an even better idea to add on to that. Every opponent can now also do the Komaki knockback. For absolutely no reason. And the crowd? Oh my god. What were they thinking with Yakuza 5's Coliseum? Why is all of this unnecessary padding that wasn't there before and didn't need to be there is there now? There's just no explanation other than to make you jump through extra hoops that you don't need to go through like I've been saying all this time. You might be thinking, man, stop being a drama queen, Leon. It only takes a few hours to unlock Victory Road. Listen, you know what it means that you have to unlock this side activity, right? There's a chance that all of this isn't really an issue to you unless perhaps you're someone that likes to revisit these games. But if you like spending hours every replay just to be able to access the Coliseum, then hey, more power to you. But personally speaking, I don't, because yeah, imagine having to unlock it every playthrough and just having to unlock it to begin with. There is a workaround, a tedious one of course, since this is Yakuza 5, but you could have a premium adventure save where you have it unlocked, and then you'd have a separate save for replays specifically. You can't really deny how extremely tedious that is if you, like me, prefer having all the characters maxed out. So you're potentially gonna have to take care of 2 different saves, and no matter what anyone says, that's a shit ton of time investment just to be able to do basic functions. You should have just been able to access the Coliseum organically with the story progression like all the other Yakuza games. If there's the concern of how they would have managed the stories of the fighters you meet as each character, then it's really simple. They could have been sub-stories where you recruit these people, or maybe even non-sub-story missions if you're worried about sub-stories getting tedious. If the concern is how they would fit the Coliseum in the main story, well, here's the shocker. They already did. In the final part where you switch between playable characters, Saejima participates in a Coliseum fight, albeit one that's without an audience. They could have had any NPC just walk up to you to tell you that you and any friends of yours can access the place if you'd like, to test your strength against other fighters. It's kind of funny because you'd think Saejima in 4 wouldn't go back to the Coliseum after the big speech he gave about killing people, but that's the game where you have instant access to it right after, rather than 5. I've been yapping a lot about why I dislike Victory Road, but let me describe the exact sequence you need to go through. Every protagonist minus Haruka will have special street encounters where you fight a single person that has slightly more HP than the average thugs. Once you do a couple of those, you'll be met with the scout for the tournament telling you all about it, and that you basically need to keep fighting participants to advance. Then, you should have an exclamation mark somewhere on the map that'll take you to a relatively strong fighter. At least stronger than the Victory Road street encounters, and they look more unique as well, and you basically get to know their motivations for joining the tournament, and you end up fighting them as well. After your first meeting with them, you have to fight more of the generic participants before you can go back to the same spot and continue this fighter's story. There's usually just 2 parts, so once the second time is finished with, that fighter will be gone for good, and now you have to fight more generic participants to come across a second fighter. This goes on for a total of 3 unique fighters that you meet as each protagonist, and you know, you have to see their whole stories through before you land in the finals. Once you do that with all of the characters, you can then progress the story of Victory Road, and you need Kiryu for that. Taking Kiryu to Kamurocho and going to the Underground Coliseum, you'll come across a guy known as Raiden, or Raiden, however you pronounce his name. He attacks Kiryu out of nowhere as a greeting, and tells him that they'll be facing each other soon in the qualifiers. But before you can actually do that, you need to leave the Coliseum and look for him in a specific specific spot in Kamurocho with an exclamation mark. There, you'll get to see a bit more dialogue and story with him before being interrupted by the tournament scout, telling you that you should now go to the arena to participate. Once there, you'll see the protag boys all waiting together to enter, and they have some small talk in the meantime. Shortly after Raiden arrives, they begin. So you fight each one of them solo as Kiryu, and you can't really change who you play as here. The last and toughest opponent is Raiden, of course. Once you beat him, there's a bit of a conclusion with him, but it doesn't really change much. But with all of that done, you can now participate in the tournament. Good job. Only takes hours of running around finding the right encounters that are actually Victory Road participants to get here. You should really feel proud of yourself. They put you through so much unnecessary shenanigans to get here after all. It's actually so annoying how it's so easy to mix up normal random encounters with Victory Road ones. It's something you don't know at first, but the Victory Road encounters have specific looking enemies, and once you know that, the process gets slightly faster. Only slightly. But that doesn't save it from the tedium, not by a goddamn long shot. Here's something kinda weird. You actually don't need to do that special tourney where you fight the protags and Raiden to unlock the arena for everybody. Once you're done with each protag's city Victory Road, you can participate here at the finale or premium adventure. But finishing the whole storyline with that special tournament will unlock the Heat Bomber Grand Prix in particular. A super specific unlock, but okay, I guess. Maybe finishing the storyline also allows you to enter the other locked tournaments once you meet their requirements, but I'm not sure of that, and correct me on it in the comments, please. It really is just a strange trip, all of this. So many specific requirements, so much running around. I feel as exhausted as you would when you update your ID and passport at a government center. I've been curious to hear about people's experiences with the Victory Road, so during the making of this video I took it to Twitter, where I felt like I would get a good mix of casual players and hardcore fans. I created a poll asking whether or not people even unlocked this thing. After over 1,600 votes, these are the results. Let me just start off by saying I think everyone agrees that the Yakuza games can be absolutely massive depending on which game we're talking about, and 5 is one of the largest in terms of content. It's a no-brainer that everybody will play these games differently. Some people might be here mainly for the story, so they won't do much side content. Others might indulge a little bit, but not extensively. And then you'll have people that'll just get 100% of the achievements. Having said that, it's quite something that around 60% of the voters here didn't bother with Victory Road. That's the majority here. And even though there were some positive comments around it, there's a good chunk of people who did vote yes, but mentioned how tedious or painful the experience was. I've also seen a surprising number of people who didn't even know the Coliseum was a thing in Yakuza 5 at all. One of those people, to my major surprise, is Snowiest. It took him a while to know that the Coliseum is actually accessible in Yakuza 5. And I do think that all of this does say something about Yakuza 5's Coliseum in particular. And lastly, I say this half jokingly, and I'm genuinely sorry if it comes off as anything but when the majority don't really delve into side content like this, it's no wonder they have no idea of the downgrades this game has. Here's another quantity over quality example. IF8. If you forgot what this is, some of the Yakuza games have this minigame called Inner Fighter, so IF to make it short. And the number changes from game to game, but Yakuza 5 has IF8. It's basically this virtual reality 2D style take on the combat where you fight virtual opponents, usually bosses that you fought throughout the story. I think it first appeared in the original Yakuza 2 and then it came back in 3, 4, 5. It might have appeared in other games, but I can't remember any others at the top of my head at the moment. Before actually doing any fights, at least in 3 and 4, you'd have to register your data so you could have the opponents listed. So usually the best time to do this would be in the final chapter or in Premium Adventure, where you don't have to worry about the story progression. You also would have to invest money to actually be able to get the new skills out of the machine. In Yakuza 3, for example, fighting each opponent once would get you something like a new hit action or skill. And I would say it wasn't really tedious at all in that game. Except if you're doing the fucking Lao Kalong fight. Whoever thought it was a good idea to fight 3 of them should In Yakuza 4, given that you have 4 playable characters, it starts to get a little more complex or tedious. You basically would have to make a trip with all the characters to the underground place where the machine is at, and register their data, and only then you should actually start doing the fights. Again, given that you have 4 characters, you would basically have to fight every boss 4 times. In total, you have 10 bosses, so you'd have to do 40 fights in total. It can get tedious, but it's worth it because not only do you get heat bar and health bar extensions, but you also get heat actions from the other protagonists because you can fight them in this machine, which I just think the idea of all that is really cool. Unfortunately, Yakuza 5's IF8 is a downgrade in almost every way imaginable. The tedium aspect, as you might have figured, is there, but it's also worse. This is Yakuza 5 after all. So the way it works in this game is actually different compared to 3 and 4, so let me explain that a little. This game goes the full length with making it 2D, so now you have to walk left and right beating generic opponents until you reach the boss or bosses. You have multiple generic enemy types. Gray ones are just the normal ones. Green and blue enemies attack either only up or only down. Red ones are bigger and tankier, but they're otherwise normal. Each character has a stage of their respective city, and then everyone has a shared Kamurocho stage. Haruka is able to participate as well, so yay, I guess. She has a unique fighting style with like 2 moves where she shoots beams out of a magic stick. So nothing really elaborate there, but it's something. Here's the downgrade part. You get heat bar upgrades as you did with 4, but that's really it in terms of direct upgrades. If I remember right, doing each city for the first time will get you said heat upgrades. So that's 2 rounds as each character so far. Male characters also have a special grudge match where you fight a story boss in normal 3D fashion, and it will give you a heat upgrade on the first play. So that's 3 rounds for the male characters and 2 for Haruka. And then after that, you can farm 8 soul orbs for each character every time you clear a stage. It doesn't matter which stage. Though, sad story, I used to think you needed to do the Kamurocho stage for the orbs, so I actually wasted a lot of time because those take way more time than the character's specific cities, or even the grudge matches. The Kamurocho stage can take like 5 minutes on average, whereas the city-specific ones take 3 minutes. Grudge matches can take less than a minute if you destroy them, because it's so straightforward. So let's add 8 onto the numbers of runs needed. So that's 11 runs needed for the male characters, and 10 for Haruka. Combined all together, that's 54 runs of IF8 needed if you want to max out all the characters. I honestly think they took like 1 step ahead by making it unique with the 2D aspect, and then 4 steps back with everything else. The 2D take is really nice and I appreciate the variety, but I think making it the bigger focus was a mistake. Yakuza 3 and 4 were much more straightforward, and it was unique how every boss had this gimmick to them that made them stand out. For example, fighting Kazuma in Yakuza 3's IF6 had this super cool unexpected switch, where you become Kazuma and Kazuma becomes you. And in this short time frame, you don't deal damage to him. You have to wait until you switch back to yourself again. In Yakuza 4's IF7 against Midorikawa, the chainsaw dude, every time you get knocked down, they have this creepy lights off effect where the screen blacks out and the guy switches from his gun style to the chainsaw style. Just little things like this are so fucking cool, and it makes the fights different from even the story versions of them. There's even one unique fight in Yakuza 3 where Kiryu fights himself in the Tojo headquarters, and they had a fucking unique quick time event just for this fight. This QuickTime event was even adjusted and reused partially in the Saejima vs Kiryu fight in Yakuza 4. Now in Yakuza 5, everyone has only one boss. Kiryu has Yahata, Saejima has Kugihara, Akiyama has Ogita, Shinada has Daigo, and Haruka has Mai. Every stage plays out the same, really. You just go from left to right until you reach the boss, and yeah. The grudge matches are really nice, and I think they should have done more of those. But one downside compared to 4 is that all these fights are just the same as the story ones, but with the virtual filter. They don't stand out at all. And when it comes to the grind, they didn't even have to reduce it by a lot compared to 4, but a little would have been nice. But no, it's Yakuza 5, it's all about content, baby. Most content in the franchise, am I right? So no, you will eat shit and you'll play this monotonous take of IF 54 times if you want to max out your characters. There's a quote-unquote feature in Yakuza 5, if you want to call it that. That is yet another non-feature in my opinion. The weapon skills. I think in theory, there could be a neat idea in there with unlocking benefits for different types of weapons you use. The way they already had it before where you unlock things like heat actions for that weapon is one of the best ways to do it. You'd get something fundamental and different enough that might be worth the effort. Or another neat thing they could have done is have it so that once you reach a certain level with a weapon, maybe you get a new moveset that plays better. And then you might get an extension of that moveset once you level it further, or a powerful new move with that weapon. There's just a lot of ideas, but the way it's implemented, as you might have guessed, is just tedious and not inspired. It's like yet another thing they added just so they could boast about content when it's not really content as much as it is a newly added cap. A forced one, on a feature that wasn't nearly as restricted. Just like with Victory Road. You start with most weapons being fairly weak, which already may just encourage you to stick with your fists, and you'd have to repeat the same 2 moves like a billion times before you can max that weapon out. And I just don't think that's fun. All you get out of it, if I remember right, is just durability increase and damage increase, which might sound good at first, but previous games allowed you to power up all weapon attacks either via certain accessories or skills learned from trainers or upgrades. Funnily enough, this is something you could argue is turn-based game design in an action game. Also, might I add, you don't have enough weapon skill to wield this weapon. What the actual fuck? Saejima can't use tasers because he has to increase his skill? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Saejima could use tasers just fine in Yakuza 4 until this weird new restriction came along. You see what I mean with this? What is the point of this besides making you jump through extra hoops to be able to achieve the same thing you could previously do without the extra steps? And without any reward that really makes it, you know, that worth it. Why even do this weird weapon skill system when you have a learning system that's cooler, like Revelations? And speaking of Revelations, they got an objective downgrade in 5 to where there's only one per character now. I guess we can put Haruka's revelation in its own corner since she's something of an unconventional character compared to the rest. 3 of the revelations you learn are unfortunately pretty specific. One of them is useless if there is no car near you. The second has to be one of the most specific heat actions in the entire franchise. It requires you to be fighting in a very specific area of Tsukimino, Saejima's city, and you also need to have a carrot in your inventory. The third is the least specific out of the bunch because you just need an iron pipe. The fourth one is my favorite because you just need an enemy that you can launch next to another enemy, and you'll be able to use it in almost any situation and any location. I don't mind Shinada's revelation that much because the weapon you get the move for is readily available most of the time, but I'd still rather something you could use without material requirements. I know what you're thinking, but Leon, later games didn't even have revelations. Yes, I'm aware. But here's the thing, those games didn't have them to begin with. Yakuza 5 brought them back and gave them a downgrade when you'd think there would be an upgrade. So all in all with Revelations, Yakuza 5 could have taken it beyond just learning heat actions, and now maybe you'd get sick weapon skills. Wait, what's that? 5 already does have that? Well, shit! Let me ask you guys this. How many of you knew that Yakuza 5 does indeed have weapon revelations? God damn, girl, this might be exciting new territory! No, it's really not. You see, weapon revelations are a thing in 5, but they do a horrendous job at telling people about it. The only mention of it as far as I know is in the memos that pop up, and those are really easy to miss. There's a lot of them and you might miss out on some important info that you don't really think is important. I mean, honestly, I don't pay attention to them, so I can't really blame anyone else for not seeing those. And in the memo about weapon skills, it specifically only says that you may unlock powerful weapon attacks, which is extremely vague, and you might think that they just mean it increases your attack power the more you use a weapon. But no, you're able to unlock a new heavy attack for very specific weapons for each character. Now, how can you know which weapons those are for each of them? Well, with guides, of course. Shout out to the legend CyricZ for always coming through with these. Can we get an average CyricZW in the comments? I honestly don't know if you're ever told which character has to use which weapons because some of these are specific as fuck. Saejima, for example, has a weapon revelation with tires, which you don't normally get unless you smash a bike twice until the tire only is left. See, instead of having you spend 2 fucking chapters with Saejima in prison where he daydreams about nothing useful, they could have dedicated a small segment somewhere in the game telling you about things like this. Because I'll be honest with you, even I forgot that this was a thing at all. Oh god, I almost completely forgot to bring that up. I'm gonna interrupt the weapon revelation talk to briefly delve into the horrendous dream segments now that I just mentioned them, and we'll be back to the revelations right after. The dream segments serve absolutely no purpose other than to bring us one step closer to seeing what a prison spin-off for Saejima would look like. They are one of the best definitions you can have of what padding is in a game. It's the kind that's similar to one in Gaiden that they could have done without, where you're also forced to visit a cabaret club for one of Akame's missions for some reason. On this channel, we sometimes joke about having a Saejima spin-off where it's him exclusively going through hijinks in prison, but holy shit, that would be horrible if this is what's waiting for us. Like, it's so boring of a segment that they resorted to implementing the daydreaming mechanic to try and keep things interesting. And of course, you don't just have one dream segment. No. How about we make you go through 2 of them? See, this would be more forgivable if Saejima's part was the first and they were trying to introduce you to some of the stuff you can do around the city, like, you know, getting into fights, visiting restaurants to heal up, cabaret clubs, but Saijima's part is the second. You'd already have gone through Kiryu's part, and by the time you get to part 2, assuming you either played the previous game or you took your time with this game as Kiryu, chances are you already likely know what a cabaret club is and how that whole process goes. So the excuse of all of this being a tutorial really doesn't hold up. Maybe you're thinking that they just want to focus on the combat tutorial that comes with the dream segment, but if that's the case, the prison part already has a few fights. They could have added just one more as a tutorial if they needed to, which is what Yakuza 4 did. Or best case scenario, they'd give you the option to just skip the dream segments because they're linear as hell anyway, and you're not doing anything new on replays. It's similar to how Yakuza 2 and 3 at the start give you the option not to reminisce on the last game's events if you don't want to. But anyway, setting all of that aside and going back to the weapon revelations, according to CyricZ's guide, the weapons for Kiryu are trash bins, stoves, and pliers. Saejima has trash bins, plants, and tires. Akiyama has bikes, beer crates, and bowling balls. Shinada has a blue-wheeled cart, beer crates, and desks. Something like bikes are everywhere on the streets, but then you have some really obscure stuff like the bowling balls or desks. So realistically, even after you spend all that time needed to get these revelations, you're very likely not gonna use at least half of the stuff you learn, unless you go out of your way to memorize or remember where each weapon can be available. You'll have to check a guide to even know where these items are if you want to unlock this stuff. Now excuse me, I'm gonna go through the pain of unlocking every one of these, or at least most of them, to report back to you whether or not they're worth it. Stay tuned. So now that we've taken a look at all of them, we arrive at the ultimate question: are these worth it? No. A big, fat no. Not unless you don't mind spending like 3 hours getting a singular, inconsequential move for a specific weapon that can range from being everywhere in the environment to literally 2 rooms in the whole game. As you saw from the footage, the damage really is far from anything crazy. The main selling point of this is just the different animations. I was playing on Legend as well, where enemies will attack you very frequently, so in a lot of my recordings, I have to adjust myself to a super convenient and remote enough location to even be able to make use of these moves. And even then, that's not a guarantee that I won't just get punched out of it, and I would have to try again for a mediocre move when I could just floor them with like 20 other better options. I also noticed that they sometimes just kinda don't work. Pretty weird. Maybe you can see what I mean with what I'm showing right now. I think a rant specifically for some of the weapon choices is in order as well. Shinada has a desk as one of the weapons you can get a revelation for, and the only place you can find one in the whole game outside of the Coliseum is in one specific fight for him in the story. Chances are you missed out on using that because you weren't thinking about the revelation at the time, and even if you were, I highly doubt that fight alone would be enough to get the revelation. So that means you need to unlock the Coliseum for Shinada to be able to access it through the Street Fight tournament, which does just have a desk in every fight. Maybe there's a tournament that I'm currently not aware of, but the revelation attack is a big area attack that would be helpful for groups of enemies. And outside of that one story fight, there's no other location you could use it for that purpose. It just sounds like a major waste to me, probably making it one of the most useless moves in the whole franchise. I felt the same way for the stove for Kiryu, where it's rare that you come across it out in the wild. And let me also talk about the fucking dolly, the blue wheeled cart. This by far is the the most annoying weapon to get a revelation for because this thing is so fucking fragile. It took me almost an hour by itself. It only has enough durability for 2 hits. And remember when I said I was playing on Legend where enemies would attack very frequently? Because of that, whenever I would end up finding specific spots around Kamurocho with these carts, and there is finally an encounter at that particular spot after resetting the city like 3 times, shit like this can happen. This one specifically can be the most tedious to get for that reason alone. And for a weapon with very specific spawns, I think this one along with the desk are especially not worth it, in a collection of revelations that are not worth it in general. Also, while recording this, I encountered a bug that I've never seen before in my life, and it caused me to lose progress for all of Akiyama's revelations. As you can see, the game is still on because the heat aura is moving, but nothing else is. I've learned from Froob that Yakuza 5 has a weird thing on PC, where if you have it above 60 FPS, it can cause problems like this. You apparently have to limit it to 60 frames in-game and also in the Nvidia control panel. I lost about an hour of progress with this, so you can imagine how thrilled I was about that, especially with this game. If you ever wondered why this video took a while, it's because something like this happens and I just lose my motivation to work on the thing for the entire day. We lost revelations so we could whack an enemy 2 bajillion times on the head so we get a slight weapon durability increase. Some of you are probably just expecting me to flat out say the combat sucks in this game, but no. I'm criticizing this game, but I'm not blind. I've said this before, but I think Yakuza 5 has a lot of merit to it, and I still stand by that. But it also takes a lot of steps backwards, and those steps can make the game a chore for me to revisit. So what's up with the combat? I mean, it brings a lot of improvements and cool new moves coming from Yakuza 4, doesn't it? Absolutely, the combat got a complete overhaul, stuff like animations of returning characters being redone, some sick heat action replacements, and the climax heat system. But let's take that last thing we just mentioned for example. I don't think climax heat is a super good system, mostly because it doesn't feel that rewarding and honestly you could do better without it a lot of the time. But maybe that's not its problem as much as it is the fact that they didn't give you better tools from it to begin with. Before I give specific examples, let me do a refresher in case someone watching forgot. Climax heat is a system that does 2 things. One of them, every time you do a heat action, you fill up this orb, and once it's full, this allows you to pull off a special heat action that is relatively powerful. The other thing is a character's special move that consumes heat over time or upon use. Kiryu, for example, can go into this rage mode which changes his moveset, allows him to dash across the map and makes him literally untouchable, as in enemies bounce off when they try to land a hit. Saejima has a mid-air grab that swings an enemy all around you to take down surrounding enemies. Akiyama flies into the air with an enemy and just kicks them anime style. Shinada, pushes people, I guess. So I'm mostly okay with this special heat action part, though I do have one small issue with it. Say that you have the climax heat gauge at full, so you can do that special heat action at any time, but you still don't want to use it and instead you want to do another heat action that overlaps with it. Well, sadly, the climax heat action will take priority, so you will be forced to use it. This can be an issue if, for example, you might want to use Kiryu's Essence of Terror to clear a bunch of normal enemies, but end up using your climax heat on one of them and now you have to rebuild the bar again. This sort of makes me prefer Yakuza 4's red heat bar system, where you'd need pretty much max heat if you want to use certain heat actions that you can't normally do with blue heat. That way you can at least make sure you don't mistakenly do a heat action you don't want to do. Most of my problems with climax heat comes from the regular special moves. Kiryu's rage mode is pretty good overall for very big crowds, but I honestly feel like it was made specifically for the last fight in his story part, because you don't really face that many at once ever again as him. The best move that comes out of this mode is the grab, which can't be blocked by any enemy in the whole game. A guaranteed throw is great when otherwise this might be what you get instead. Other than that, rage mode is super limited and there really isn't much you can do with it. I think it has like one heat action that is specific to it, but it's really nothing that impressive. Depending on the fight, I think you generally can destroy groups better with bounding throws and the Essence of Terror. Saejima's regular climax move is actually the one that I like the most and I have the least problems with. It's just useful all around in any situation with multiple enemies. But then you have this other charge move that is pretty nice if you manage to grab an enemy by the leg successfully, because even regular enemies can just break free if they feel like it and you have no way of knowing if the grab will succeed. Saejima can also unlock the ability to rip off heavy objects off the ground and use them as special weapons that deal a lot of damage, which can be really handy for groups. Akiyama's regular climax move would be my least favorite if Shinada's moves didn't exist, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, you could argue that Kiryu and Saejima are the only two that deserve Herculean moves like theirs, where they could focus on groups rather than a single target, but it's not like Akiyama's a slouch when it comes to fights. This guy's legwork puts the others to shame, and the best thing they came up for him is mid-air kicking a single enemy that isn't even guaranteed to work on bosses. This move is alright, but you have to work quite a bit for it to just end up being alright. It's only with the last tech upgrade that this move becomes unblockable, and that comes after doing the breakthrough, which can take a bit of grinding given that Akiyama's part in the game is shorter compared to the other pro tags. And even with that upgrade, a dipshit like Ogita can just dodge out of it. So, an ability that works only sometimes? There's a recurring theme here, because I feel like even with Akiyama, you might be better off just not using that ability most of the time. You're better off doing a heat action to get basically the same outcome. And then we have Shinada's Meteor Tackle. Wow. Look at this beauty. Look, I get it. Shinada's a regular guy, quote-unquote regular guy. He's a broke, poor fella who's just minding his own business, just a poor little thing who only does, 5,000 swings, 1,000 push-ups, and 1,000 sit-ups a day. The guy's only just more jacked than the other protagonists, even with more muscle mass than Saejima. There's no way a guy like him can come up with crowd control that's more effective, right? I mean, look, no, okay? What the hell is this? This move is so bad, you're better off just individually singling out each enemy with your rush combos and heat actions. Or weapons. The best thing this move can accomplish is knocking down multiple enemies, which really doesn't accomplish much, and being able to access a specific heat action. That's it. And by the way, this move can be stopped eventually, so cool, I guess. Ultimate move. Look, as long as a character like Tanimura, Tatsuya, or Yagami exist, the excuse of, oh, but he's just a regular Joe, just won't fly. Yagami is supposed to be a regular Joe, at least more than the mainline protags, and he pulls off moves flashier and crazier than most of the mainline protags. These guys live in a universe where even the average Joe can be an absolute monster. I hate that I'm even going into this because arguing about Yakuza power levels is pointless. The truth is, a character will lose whenever the plot demands it, and that's no excuse for their combat to not be fun. And that's all I ask. Do what you want with the story, but the combat should be fun. Moving past the climax heat system, we can now talk about other aspects of the combat that I'm not fond of. Let's talk about Akiyama's combat in general. Despite getting a lot of new things to work with in 5, he just feels worse to play. And I don't mean to say that Akiyama absolutely sucks in 5, but it's just enough to make me miss how he plays in 4, as I feel his kicks in that game actually overwhelmed enemies. I think the hit feedback was better and snappier there. And that's not an Akiyama issue per se, it's just a general one, but I feel like it's more noticeable with him because he's the one character who has a lot of quick multi-hits in his rush combo. The absence of wall bounding that was present in 4 hurts Akiyama a lot for me. It used to enable insane comboing and gave an additional way of damaging enemies, but with that gone, it crippled one of the best things you could do with him that made him stand out from the other playable characters. Some of you may know what I'm talking about, but something that made Akiyama super fun in 4 is how his quick step cancel abilities worked, where he could dodge during a rush combo to either move around real quick or do a tackle and potentially start another round of kicking the enemy around before they eventually fall on the ground again. Like, we're talking full-on Tekken combos with this one. This guy could pull off one of them death combos. Now compare that to Yakuza 5, where he does also have the quick step cancel, but you can't do those Tekken combos anymore, or at least nowhere near as consistently. For some reason, if you want to pull off a successful dodge after a rush combo finisher, you'd have to be almost mashing the dodge button, and because of something weird going on with the input timing, you usually can do the tackle that can come after it. In my recordings for this video, I did manage to do it maybe once or twice, but every other time I tried to do it, it just didn't work. If this still doesn't make much sense, I'd like to give a quick side-by-side comparison of specific inputs and show what it does in Yakuza 4 versus Yakuza 5. As you just saw, this might be the best demonstration of what I mean when I talk about how his gameplay in 5 feels off. Trying to do this in 5 also often causes another mistake, using the launcher when you don't want to. Now answer this for me, viewer, because I'm genuinely curious. How many times have you accidentally used the launcher with Akiyama in general? If I had $1 for every instance, I think I would be able to afford multiple game collector editions. This is actually another reason why I'm not fond of this climax heat ability of his. Something tells me it's a secondary suspect aspect alongside the lack of wall bounding that just kills his momentum in this game and literally interferes with your inputs. Akiyama is a speed-oriented character, but it feels like Yakuza 5 simultaneously wants to highlight that and is also scared of it. So on one hand, Akiyama's light attack kicks can be extended so much more in 5 compared to 4, but you barely get a situation where you actually make use of all of those additional kicks without being blocked or interrupted, even when you get behind an enemy to do that. When you do that, there's this weird hitbox thing going on where they might slowly rotate them back to face you. Best way I can describe it is the hitbox feedback in 5 feels slippery, like the enemies rub themselves in oil before fighting you. I don't really have many issues with Saejima in 5, he's probably the most improved out of the returning characters. His health bar is enormous, and I love that. And the fact that he has an equivalent of Tanga Drop is huge, and gives him a massive advantage when he already is pretty strong as is. One thing I'll point out is how his rush combo, probably due to the animation rework, is slightly slower in 5. Like you can see him wind up the punches a little more in 5. And also the guard breaking can be a little weird as it doesn't always seem to work, but I think it's just something with certain bosses or enemies where you can't do that to them if they're in heat mode or something. I could be wrong on that though. There's something all the characters share, these secret abilities that rely on timing your rush combo inputs to provide bonuses like increased heat gain, extra damage, hyper armor, or breaking an enemy's guard. Kiryu has the guard break and hyper armor abilities, Saejima has the hyper armor and extra damage abilities, Akiyama has the heat gain and extra damage abilities, and finally Shinada has the guard break and increased heat gain abilities. This is an idea that I sort of like and dislike at the same time. Because of how it works, you can't really abuse it. You may only trigger it once every now and then. That's assuming you're an average player. If you know what you're doing, you could probably practice the timing and maybe trigger them pretty much whenever you want. Outside of that though, I feel like these are very forgettable. I think I would have preferred to have it be something like every second hit triggers that bonus, or even have it be where it's completely randomized. Also, I really wish Akiyama got the guard break secret because it might have made his multi-kicks more viable. There's an idea in this kind of ability, but I do think that as it is, it feels like ability padding. And then we have Shinada's combat. Oh man, this guy, believe me, I do appreciate how different his fighting style is, and it's not completely terrible, but he is often on the bottom of the Yakuza 5 combat ranking for a lot of people for a reason. This will absolutely trigger someone out there, but I personally found Tanimura to be so much more enjoyable. Much more enjoyable. Shinada's crowd control is almost non-existent, which Tanimura at least has something viable that deals more than 1 damage. Shinada also lacks a good counter, which Tanimura also has. What Shinada lacks barehanded, he sort of makes up for with weapons, whereas Tanimura is designed without weapons in mind, so you don't need to fall back onto them. Efficient Shinada gameplay can be summarized in light attack, heavy attack, grab, full stop. You're more than welcome to do other things, but eventually, you'll come back to light attack, heavy attack, and grab. Classic combo for Shinada. That move is just one of the best he can do in most situations. The guaranteed grab on heavy attack is just that good. Going back a bit to the counter that I mentioned for Shinada, you can unlock it for him in the tech category around level 10, so it takes a good bit to actually get it. But it sucks. It's a counter that really doesn't pay off that well. So the way it works is you lock onto an enemy, and right before they attack, you press the grab button and Shinada will dodge behind them and grab them. It's okay when it works. Sometimes enemies, including just normal enemies, will just break free and you'd have accomplished nothing. And I think the counter itself is just really boring. It's a normal grab. Tanimura's counter can be used on just about every enemy minus Suguchi in his heat mode. And it has really clever uses like using it against the wall to easily knock down enemies that are otherwise really annoying about it, and then maybe finish them off with a heat action. You could also have fun with wall banding them a bit in the Yakuza 4. One of my favorite targets for Tanimura's counter are brass knuckles enemies. If you've played Yakuza 3 and 4, I think you understand exactly how insufferable those can be. Tanimura can just have them eat the wall with minimal effort. It becomes even easier if you upgrade the parry duration by training with Nair. Actually, let me go back to a point that I find cool and may not be completely relevant to this video, but can we appreciate how the Tanimura part's final boss is a direct counter to him in the coolest way possible? And they did it so well because it's not a counter in the sense that you get stun locked to oblivion and back, and that's what they'd call creativity. It's something so simple yet so unique, and it makes Sugiuchi stand out amongst the other bosses. Come to think of it, I'm not sure I remember many other boss fights making use of a cool little detail like this one. Can you guys think of any? But going back to Shinada, the guy definitely has his moments in combat, but it's not my top pick for something that I would want to revisit. Just to wrap up this combat segment with something interesting, I went ahead and did a poll on Twitter not too long ago where I asked people who they found most enjoyable in both Yakuza 4 and 5. The results may or may not surprise you, and they may or may not prove some of my points. First, we're going to take a look at the Yakuza 5 poll. You may be wondering why we're not doing them in order, and there's a reason for that. Just hear me out. Over 4,500 people participated in this, so we have a sizable demographic. And it's safe to assume it's a good mix of casual and hardcore fans. And here it is. Unsurprisingly, Kiryu is in first place with 44.1% of the votes. He just has a lot of tools to work with in 5, and he's the most powerful character by far. The bounding throws in this game not consuming heat alone makes him break a lot of fights. At second place, we have Akiyama at 30.5% of the votes. Even with the quote-unquote nerf he got in 5, he's still very fun. I think speed-oriented characters in general just feel really good to play as. Now at third place, maybe surprisingly, maybe not, is Saejima at 15.1%. I assume it's mainly because he's not as fast as Akiyama, or maybe he just doesn't have enough going for him, especially if people didn't bother unlocking the cooler stuff for him like his counter and Herculean Spirit, both of which are locked behind training and they do sort of require you to go out of your way to get them. But once you do, Saejima becomes an unstoppable machine, a big improvement over his 4 gameplay if you also factor in the newer moves they gave him. Coming in the last place is Shinada at only 10.3%. I don't think this shocks anybody. Saejima may be slow, but he's still powerful and has a bunch of really good moves. You can't say the same about Shinada. Some people may appreciate him more than others, but it doesn't change the fact that he's much more limited, and part of his skill set lies in weapons. Now moving on to the Yakuza 4 poll, this one is going to be quite revealing. Over 3,700 people participated in this one. Here are the results. Where do we even begin? Akiyama fucking sweeps this one and it's not even close. Coming at 60.7%, he's a clear winner. Perhaps this does prove that I'm not crazy and he really was much more fun in 4 than he was in 5. He still is fun in 5 for me, but he could have been so much better. Here's one clip someone attached after they voted for Akiyama. At the second place lies Kiryu at 15.4%, a very close number to Tanimura. Kiryu in 4 feels much better to play than in 3. He feels faster, he starts out with abilities already unlocked, and he's just Kiryu. Maybe it's because he's not too different from how he played in 3 that he scored so low. After him is Tanimura at exactly 15%. Being this close to Kiryu is no small feat. And it's quite the difference from the Yakuza 5 poll where Shinada was at the very bottom and it wasn't a close match as it is with Tanimura here. And finally we have Saejima at a measly 8.8%. I honestly don't know if I expected him to be this much lower than Tanimura, but I do understand it. I think as far as the fun factor goes, I would also put Tanimura above Saejima for this game. He just has a lot more technicality to him. Saejima is still very powerful in 4, but he definitely had a glow up in 5, and even that didn't put him above Akiyama for a lot of people. I should also mention that both Tanimura and Shinada, being the outliers, received a lot of love in the comments for different reasons. So if you're a fan of both and you think they deserve more love, then, you know, rest assured, people love these characters, me included. Random encounters. Here it is. You're probably wondering when I was gonna bring this up since this is one of the most annoying things about Yakuza 5 for me. I figured it would be too predictable to just mention this the first and foremost. But no, I wanted to, you know, take my time talking about other things and I saved it for here. I highlight this particular point in another video of mine that I recommend you'd watch if you're enjoying this video. Think of that other video as a more humorous take on this video, where you can see clear examples of what my issues with the encounters are. But setting that video aside, let's talk about it from square one. Prior to Yakuza 5, encounters used to work in a way where there are specific spawns throughout the city that enemies could be in. That made it much easier to predict them, spot them, and avoid them. In 5, that's not the case at all. They actually added multiple ways for a fight to start, which, mind you, by itself is not a problem. Some of those ways include coming across a bunch of guys just squatting together, or coming across 2 people arguing only for them to take their anger out on you, or bumping into someone that normally wouldn't run up to you, and so on and so forth. These create extra and creative scenarios scenarios out on the street for the protags to get into fights. The problem with 5's encounters stem from the fact that finishing an encounter will not despawn other encounters around you, so that, you know, you could take a breather, which is how the previous games worked. This creates situations where you could get into 2 encounters, 3 encounters, maybe if you're super unlucky, 4 encounters right after each other. I'm pretty sure I get like 3 encounters in a row in the video that I brought up earlier. People tend to say, oh, just walk. If I recall correctly, Yakuza 5 does tell you that if you were to just walk, street thugs will ignore you. The problem is, and maybe this is just me, but holy shit, walking has never felt slower in a Yakuza game. And even by walking, another issue gets highlighted, which can also be seen in the video that I referenced. I mentioned street thugs that blend in unless you bump into them, but bumping into them while walking still counts. And trust me, they can blend in pretty well. Walking is made even more tedious by the fact that Yakuza 5 decided for absolutely no reason that they'd go the extra mile to add extra slowdowns whenever you touch a single pixel of a person walking by. It is insanely annoying, and it's just a Yakuza 5 thing. Let me show you guys a short clip where I get into 3 encounters in a row in basically the same spot. And then after that, in another spot, I get roped into a second encounter after finishing one without me taking a single fucking step. Like, you literally couldn't see anything because the fight just finished loading and the city itself was loading. Watch. Yeah, the most important thing about emotes... Oh shit. No! Gotta love Tsukimono, right guys? Yeah, Jet. Was I saying something? I think about emotes. Man, there's... What the... Actual fuck! Man, come on! Excuse me? Why is Yakuza 5 like this, dude? Hello? Oh, just use the beads of good fortune, they say. Hey, that's not a bad solution. So, the beads of good fortune, if you don't know, is an accessory that disables random encounters completely. You can obtain them twice in a single playthrough. Sounds good, right? Kind of. You can obtain one from the Another Haruka substory for Kiryu, which is really easy. But if you want the second one, that's gonna require you to open all Kamurocho coin lockers. So that means you'll go out for a hunt for 50 keys scattered all around Kamurocho, while you probably gawk at a guide for who knows how long. Which in itself might take the same amount of time to beat the game again, to, you know, get another copy of the beads from that substory again. So what that means is, if you want to get the beads of good fortune on every character, minus Haruka of course, you'll need at the bare minimum 2 full playthroughs if you're willing to do all of the Kamurocho coin lockers twice. Or 4 playthroughs if you don't want to bother with the coin lockers and prefer doing 2 extra playthroughs, which that is what I went for, by the way. Up to 4 playthroughs is a shit ton of time investment needed just to be able to disable all encounters for all the protagonists simultaneously. And mind you, this is normally not an issue for a Yakuza game, but we're talking about the Yakuza game with the worst encounters. To my knowledge, the item box in the story isn't shared until the finale, so you can't pass the beats from Kiryu to Saejima before you move on to his chapter. Instead, you'll have to wait until the finale and give it to whatever character you think needs it most for the next playthrough. A lot of this hassle could have been made easier if this game allowed you to go into premium adventure, set things up, and then from there, back to the story. But Yakuza 5 is just that special. It doesn't want you to do that. And before I forget, on the topic of encounters, holy shit do they suck on Saejima City. Tsukimino by itself already isn't designed super well for navigation because it's basically just a corridor city where most of the streets are off limits. Don't get me wrong, visually the city is very pretty, but getting around it is ass. Having a city that's basically just narrow pavements can make random encounters doubly annoying than they already are because there's barely any space to just run or walk by. And again, you can see some examples in the video that I mentioned earlier. Another thing I heard a couple of times when I talked about 5's random encounters is, oh, am I the only one who enjoys the random encounters? Where do I begin? No, obviously not. Whoever says something like this probably played this particular game a singular time and never went back to it. But you're watching a guy who has hundreds of hours in this game, having finished probably a couple dozen playthroughs. And I also had to restart from the beginning because, you know, when the PC ports came out, I basically had to start from scratch. And all of that by itself isn't nearly enough to get me to be sick of it, by the way, because if it did, I'd be bitching about all of the other games' random encounters too. Look at it this way. Whenever I, the content creator, come back to this game for streaming, it's usually just to replay the whole story. That's the focus, not the encounters. The encounters only extend the time it takes for me to beat the game. But if I were to, say for example, stream Premium Adventure, then fuck yeah, bring on all the random encounters. I wouldn't give as much of a shit, really. Consider what I said up until now, and you should see where I'm coming from, even if you don't particularly agree. And again, I'm not even asking anyone to agree, by the way, just to try and understand me. Yakuza 5 is the only game where it's possible for you to get into multiple encounters in a row because said encounters can be a literal step or two away from one another. Combine that with the tedious factors that I mentioned earlier, particularly the dialogue point, and also combine all of that with the fact that as someone with hundreds of hours in this game, random encounters don't really do much for me anymore. And hey, maybe you're someone who still very specifically enjoys Yakuza 5's random encounters, even with over 500 hours in, which is probably a whopping total of one person watching this right now. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would expect that you'd also understand where I'm coming from with all of this. So this one is a relatively general point, and it isn't about one thing in particular. I'll just mention a few random things that are weird to me. But here's one example. The Saejima part. Listen, we all meme about Saejima being married to prison, right? But 2 whole chapters in prison seems a little much. You get to the village in his chapter 3, and that whole chapter is a tutorial for the hunting minigame, which is more than a little excessive for me. If you want to talk about the most dragged out side activity tutorial, well, this one takes the cake. But the one thing that blows my mind the most is you only get to see the city assigned to him in his last chapter. It almost feels to me like they wanted to hold off on it as much as they could. Like this was the game's way of acknowledging that Tsukimino really wasn't designed the best compared to the other cities. And I mean, I think the fact that you only have a few story objectives to do there before finishing his part is reason enough for me to believe so. Akiyama sharing a part with Haruka makes sense on the surface since they're in the same city, and he's looking out for her. But I do wonder if one of the two was made playable just for the sake of having more content than 4. Akiyama is the only character in the roster that doesn't have a major side story after all. Kiryu has his taxi side plot, Saejima has the village story and hunting, Haruka has a lot of different activities with her idol career, Shinada has a baseball-related story with people he used to know, and then there's Akiyama, just existing. This particular point with Akiyama doesn't bother me as much as everything else that I've mentioned, but he definitely stands out in that regard. It makes me wonder if he was someone they just shoved in there at some point and made it sort of work. Something very minor that also gets to me more than it should sometimes is how taxi load times are for some reason noticeably longer in 5. Here's a direct comparison between Yakuza 4 and 5. Yakuza 4's item box has a really neat feature that allows you to move items from the item box or the inventory of the character you're controlling directly to another protagonist's inventory. This is amazing because you only need one character to manage everyone's inventories, and just being able to do that saves you a lot of loading screens worth of time. Yakuza 5 for some reason gets rid of this, and it makes the process longer by forcing you to deposit items as one character and then withdraw them as the other, where it'll just be one loading screen after another. And the more inventories you're managing, the more of a chore this becomes. Okay, I contemplated multiple times whether or not to include anything story related in this video, and after some thinking, I decided not to do that and possibly save it for another time. There's a good number of things I could say about the story, but that's a topic that is super subjective, even more so than some of the things that I've been talking about here. And I feel like if I were to delve into that now, then everything I've been talking about until now might dilute and people might only focus on the story part and how they disagree with all of that, and probably just forget about my problems with the gameplay, and then it'll go back full circle. People think that I'm just yapping for the sake of it. Once again, the goal of this video has never been to make people agree with me and then for me to get upset when that doesn't happen. I really don't care. I'm just trying to demonstrate exactly what I find tedious with Yakuza 5 while trying to present reasons that I hope are understandable. You may find Yakuza 5 to be the best game of the entire franchise, and hey, more power to you. Like I've said earlier, I still think it's a wonderful game overall. It has an ambitious story with multiple playable characters, and there's a ton of content. There's just something for everybody with this game. But personally, compared to other Yakuza games, I just happen to have more problems with it than the average Yakuza game. And said problems just make the game a chore for me to revisit. But despite everything, this is a game that's still at the bare minimum a 7 out of 10. That's really all there is to it. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope this was at least somewhat enjoyable of a watch. This video was long overdue, and I'm glad to finally have something neat and organized I can just send to people that ask me, Leon, why do you hate Yakuza 5? A small fun fact that I don't think is gonna surprise people, but the first 4,000 or so words of the script, I just sat down and typed them all in one sitting. That's how easy the words came to me for it. The full script being close to 10,000 words now. So I basically wrote half the thing in one sitting. This is future Leon. Forget what you just heard because I ended up adding a lot more than I expected to, and the script ended up being in multiple word files, so I don't even know the total word count right now. So that was fun, I guess. I definitely want to continue doing more essay type videos after this, so if you're hungry for more of this kind of video, stay tuned and hopefully you'll get something else that's enjoyable. Oh, by the way, I would be curious to see what you guys are interested in seeing essay videos of, so maybe let me know down in the comments. Also, before we close off, a big thank you as usual to all of my Honey tier members and all the Dragon tier members, and all of you watching this. Once again, thank you. Just everybody that ever contributed anything for the channel. Thank you. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, whatever that may be. Bye bye.